I'm hoping that everyone will start to put their cameras back on so that I know that they're back in the room. Given that it is 1:15, we'd hopefully start again. Just give another 30 seconds or so for everyone else to join back in on their videos. And I see we are now streaming too, so why don't I make us start back? I think most people, they're either still connected with their video off, which means they're probably quickly having some breakfast, or but I'm sure they're listening in. So welcome back, everybody, and welcome to our public observers who have now joined us via YouTube. We have just had our first breakout group, and we had 50 minutes to discuss the expectation gap relating to fraud and going concern. And now we're going to start the debrief on those discussions. So what we will do is I'll kick off first, and then we have 4 other presenters that I'm very grateful for, which will also just give a brief summary of the conversations that they moderated in their breakout groups, which will be Josephine and Julie, who are fellow board members, and then 2 very experienced staff members being Dan Montgomery and Billy Bolter will also give feedback on the sessions they moderated as well. So I'll kick off first, and if we could try and keep our discussion to 1 minute, which is incredibly difficult given the robust conversations that I'm sure everyone else was having in their breakout groups like we were. So hopefully in 1 minute or less, we did take a lot of detailed notes as well, which is incredibly helpful. Overall, there was consensus that the expectation gap for going concern and the expectation gap for fraud were different, and the drivers of what was driving them were different. We reached consensus on that reasonably quickly. We were really privileged that 3 out of our 4 participants are very experienced non-executive directors on audit committees, as well as audit committee chairs, amongst other things that they have. So we got some really good insights into the expectation gap from their perspective as well. There were mixed views as to the cause, but I think we got general consensus that it was probably a combination of all 3. Some obviously mixed views on how much of it was knowledge gap versus performance gap, for example. Because we were so excited to talk about question 1 and I was watching the clock, we skipped question 2 and question 3 just so that we could at least have one group that would cover off the last 2 questions as well. And so for question 4 and 5, again, general consensus that auditors probably needed to be doing more on fraud, and one suggestion was around making a required CAM related to the fraud procedures, for example. And there was also a resounding yes to the concept of having transparency, although not just for transparency's sake. And I really like the way one of our participants, I think it was Jerez, described it as transparency between the auditor and the audit committee being one element of it, but also transparency to the capital markets as well. So that's my 1 minute or less. We did get lots of suggestions as well as to who else was part of the ecosystem. And the one that probably I hadn't considered previously that was raised was the proxy advisors as well, as they have an increasing influence in a number of jurisdictions as well. So that's my 1 minute that I went over, I'm sure. I'm going to pass to breakout group B, which I think Josephine, you moderated that breakout group.
I'm actually C, so I'll hand to Julie for B.
Sorry, I've got the wrong order. My apologies. Right.
Yeah, I'm D, but I'm happy to go next. I'll go next.
I don't know my alphabet, sorry. Who was B, out of curiosity? And we'll go to B. Who was that? Was that you, Dan?
That was me, yes.
Dan, you're B. Go for B then. Thank you, Dan.
Okay, thank you. And I'm happy to cover Group B. And similarly, a lot of great comments made and many notes taken. Difficult to summarize in a minute, but I'll try to do that. It started off by an acknowledgement, which I think we can all agree that the concept of the expectation gap has been discussed for a very long time, and many things have been tried, but the profession has not been quite able to explain to the public yet clearly about what an audit is or what the auditor's responsibilities are. Yet there's an expectation, certainly, and a right for investors to better understand that. So bridging that gap is clearly important. Like the previous group, in Fiona's comment, this group indicated that fraud and going concern gaps were very different and perhaps different aspects of that expectation gap as discussed in the discussion paper, that fraud was more about the evolution gap, that there's perhaps more that auditors can do, and the going concern is looking into a crystal ball, and that there are certainly inherent limitations, and we have to be realistic about looking into the future and perhaps what auditors are realistically capable of doing. So it's perhaps more there about the knowledge gap. With respect to fraud, there was quite a bit of discussion about what perhaps could be done. The one aspect was the involvement of, or more involvement of specialists, perhaps forensic specialists, better opportunity there. Also a little bit of discussion about the suspicious mindset, but a caution there about the implications for the relationship with management. And then on going concern, again, another caution about the limitations on how much better auditors actually can get in this area. That because we're looking into the future, perhaps the best approach is for management to focus more on disclosures, making sure that investors have the very best information, and the auditor's responsibilities are more focused on making sure that those disclosures are complete and accurate. And the last bit just on transparency is to, for both fraud and going concern, which will be discussed a little bit more later, but on fraud in particular, be sensitive to adding more information in the auditor's report or elsewhere, that we wouldn't be doing any favors by describing auditor responsibilities without the ability to actually perform against enhanced expectations. So that's it.
Thanks, Dan. I think I've got my alphabet sorted now. So it's A, B, and then C, I think, is Josephine, if I wrote it down properly. Josephine, are you Group C?
Yeah, thank you. So also great, very rich discussion. We could have talked for hours, and I did feel quite awful having to cut people off when they were trying to get another aspect of their thoughts out. So thanks to my participants. Similarly, fraud, going concern, different topics and need to be addressed differently. Participants generally did support the components of the expectation gap that we have talked about, but there is a definite need to have more information about both auditor and management's responsibilities in terms of the knowledge gap in particular. In fraud, it was actually noted that more attention could be given to the qualitative aspects of fraud. So small frauds, for example, that are disclosed, they shouldn't really be overlooked either. And of course, more disclosures of those are desirable. But the panel also agreed that there is a balance needed, similar to Dan's point, I guess, in achieving, at the end of the day, reasonable assurance and then following up on every single aspect or every single fraud in an entity. So there's a balance there that's needed. On a similar vein, in respect to going concern, there is a desire for greater disclosure by management, and in turn, and nestled in there, thinking about the threshold to which management actually reports. But again, important to have the right balance. You need to make sure that you don't end up in a situation where everybody is disclosing every single thought, and therefore you can't see the wood for the trees in those disclosures. So very interesting discussion there. There generally is a desire in our group for more work in the narrative part of the front end of the the annual report, and not just a consistency check. And to be fair, Fiona, the other comments that we made were very similar to Dan and yourself. Thank you.
Thanks, Josephine. Julie, I think you had Group D.
We had Group D, and we also had a great discussion, and it's going to start to sound a little repetitive, some of my comments, but I'll touch on the key points that we talked about. We talked about the knowledge gap versus performance gap. I think that the group felt that there was a knowledge gap, but there was also components of the other pieces of the expectation gap that were at play. We certainly had some discussion about the performance gap. However, interesting that we didn't have a view that the standards were necessarily broken, and that would be supported by the poll that we took before we went into the breakout. But definitely some interesting comments around, is there a case for modernizing some of the standards at this point, particularly in areas where many years ago the focus might have been in something like a journal entry task, but today that's maybe not where frauds are really happening. So could we think about modernizing them a bit? The other key point there was just having the auditor consider more broadly external factors, external red flags. Are they spending enough time thinking about the sort of environment in which their companies are operating in the context of the audit? Some of the things that we could be considering doing, definitely support for technology and making sure we leverage that to the greatest extent possible. We did have a discussion about forensic specialists. I think it's an interesting concept, but also some caution to be taken there. There's a scalability and an availability concern, but also forensic audits tend to be very targeted and specialized. And is that really going to fit in the context of an overall financial statement audit? We talked about transparency. I think similar to other groups, I think people would be welcome transparency, but we need to make sure it's meaningful and just doesn't become boilerplate transparency around more things that the auditor is just reporting on. And then lastly, in the question 5, we talked a little bit about whether the SOX approach might be helpful in some of these areas. Definitely in jurisdictions where they have that approach, it's been very beneficial. So we talked a little bit about that, and some of the concepts around making sure preparers and auditors have a questioning mind, and that those charts of governance definitely have a role to play in all of this. I think that covers it, Fiona.
Thanks, Julie. And Vili, not last because you're least, but I'm sure you have lots of really good insights as well. So Vili, you were Group E.
Thank you, Fiona. I thought when we were going to get to E, I'll just say, well, everything has been said already, but I actually do have a few additional perspectives. Obviously, a lot of consistency between the discussions between the different groups. So I want to point out a few things. In our group, also a lot of discussion around the role of all the players within the ecosystem. I think that's a message that we've heard consistently. Also the notion that from a fraud side, the causes of the gap is more linked to the performance and the evolution side of it, whereas for going concern, maybe a little bit more to the knowledge gap. I do think some of the interesting things that came out of our group in terms of the performance gap, especially when you look at fraud, is how auditors are actually using the standards. And a few thoughts there was, doing the basic things right all of the time. How is it possible that if you follow the standards, you can miss that there's billions of dollars not on a balance sheet? That type of perspective came through. There was also an interesting comment around, when we audit, we accept that in terms of the standard, we want to obtain evidence that the financial statements are free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. And do auditors focus equally or in balance on both those aspects of error and fraud? There was also a notion that, or a sense, especially from some of the user and those charged with governance perspectives in the group, that they have a sense that sometimes it's as if that last piece is missing, that auditors sometimes struggle to put all the pieces together and really understand the story, all what's underlying to the financial statements, and if there's a way that can be elevated in terms of looking at the whole picture. And then also there was a comment around soft issues, that do we focus enough on behavioral aspects, culture aspects, tone at the top, and do we have the ability to look through those soft issues to also see the underlying issues that there could be. And then the last one that I want to share, maybe from a going concern perspective, I think we had a very interesting discussion that to say, you almost have, with a going concern concept, there's almost, from a business point of view, there's an inherent limitation to going concern, because a business will naturally protect itself up to the last minute before it says something about going concern. Otherwise, it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And one of the suggestions we had in the group is that if management and those charged with governance, a lot from that perspective, if management and those charged with governance get into the habit of proper risk reporting on a regular basis, and the investors are used to getting this information, then if there's an uncertainty around going concern, then it's not unexpected or such a surprise as it often is. So I think those are some of the perspectives I just wanted to add from our group.
Thanks, Philly. I think you must have had a spy in our discussion group, because self-fulfilling prophecy got talked about in our group, and I suspect if anyone else talked about going concern, it probably got talked about in their breakout groups too. We now have 15 minutes before we're going to go into another breakout group, but this is an opportunity for anything else people wanted to raise. Feel free to be as controversial as you would like. Don't suddenly go shy on us now that we're all in the large group and you've decided you don't want to talk anymore, but we will use the raise hand functionality, the little blue hand, which means I can see who might have some other things they wanted to raise, comments they wanted to provide. Maybe you didn't get enough time on that last question talking about what some of the things that could be done, not just by the IAASB, but by others in the ecosystem. So this is your opportunity so that we can have an open discussion on anything else you want to talk about on this particular topic around the fraud and going concern expectation gap. And if any of my colleagues from the board who have been observing wanted to comment as well, oh, Josephine, I love you. There's always someone who has to put their hand up first to get the ball rolling. And this was not a plant. So thank you very much, Josephine, putting your hand up first. I'll go to you.
Oh, I just thought I'd mention something that came out of our discussions, which might get the ball rolling. And it was whether, slightly controversial, it's whether we even need to worry about the knowledge gap anymore, because ultimately the demand for the public and the way that the audits should be performed in their eyes and what they need, that should also get us to reducing the knowledge gap as well. So do we even need to concentrate on the knowledge gap anymore? And I thought that was quite an interesting theme that came through. So I thought I'd raise that point, see if anybody had a view on that particular point.
And Maggie put her hand up quick smart. She took it down again, but then put it back up. I wasn't sure if it was a mistake, but she has definitely put it up and left it there. So Maggie, over to you.
Thanks very much. And just coming in off that question by Josephine, I think it's fair to say, I mean, the expectation gap has been with us for decades. I think it's first mentioned in the earliest mention I could get of it was 1974. And in some ways that says, well, why haven't you resolved it? But actually, I think the expectation gap and the knowledge part of that gap has changed over that time, and expectations have continued to rise. But I think it's still an important matter that needs to be addressed. It doesn't mean that we ignore how audit needs to evolve and change into the future, but actually, unless we can address the knowledge gap and the performance gap, I think we'll always have a slight misunderstanding in terms of where the evolution can happen. So I think there's still a task on us as a profession to really make sure that we look to address the knowledge gap.
Thanks, Maggie. And I've fallen down on my moderator duties and instructions. So I know who Maggie is because she was in my breakout group. But when I throw to the next person, which is going to be Charles, maybe just a quick where you're from as well to give context to everyone else as well. But Maggie, for everyone else's benefit, is an Executive Director of Governance at ACCA. And next out of the blue hands, once you've spoken, if you want to put your hand down again, I think Josephine and Maggie, your hands are both still up. But the next on the list was Charles, wanted to make some comments.
Okay, thank you. Charles Henderson. I'm from the UK. I'm a director of the UK Shareholders Association and also a member of the FRC's Audit Quality Review Committee. And I used to work at Invesco, helping fund managers with issues on their investments around corporate governance and corporate finance. I just wanted to say in response to Josephine's point is that from a user perspective, an investor's perspective, I think trying to do something about the knowledge gap is definitely worth doing, and I would refer to the Bryden report in the UK, which talked about audits having been producer-led rather than user-led to date. And I think auditors and audit firms could do a lot more in engaging with users around their expectations. And I think one of the Bryden review suggestions of involving investors, the shareholders in companies in the planning stage of audits, and trying to get key requirements out of them during the planning stage, and then explaining how they've been responded to, would be a good way to go.
Thanks, Charles. Can I ask a dumb question then? And that's what most of my questions are, in case anyone who doesn't know me. But I'm just curious how that engagement piece would work with shareholders. Would it be through a shareholder association, for example, that you would have that conversation in the planning phase? Or was there some other sort of process or suggestion as to how that would work?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. It probably depends on the company being audited and how much access they have to the actual beneficial investors in their organisation. But they'd probably would have the starting point of going through their register and seeing who the key shareholders are, and then trying to approach them to see if they had anything required from audit. And I would think that probably those tasked in governance could lead the way through such things as the audit committee, the board audit committee, for example.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, those charged with governance would be connected into those key shareholders at least, and obviously key management would be as well through the various, investor and analyst briefings and other things they do. So there, in theory, could be a way to do it. I was just reflecting on large listed clients that I sign off on that I think, I wonder how we would do that, because there's no natural, few shareholders, for example, that you would go to get that insight. But I certainly take the point that it's worth considering and thinking about what really are their needs, and no better way to get that clear in your mind as an auditor than actually asking them, which is something we don't do at the moment. I think we all just we reflect on what the needs of the users are, because that helps determine materiality and a whole lot of other things, but we don't necessarily, if ever, connect in directly with the shareholders. So it's an interesting observation to make. So thanks, Charles. Sorry to put you on the spot with a question that we hadn't prepared for, so I apologise. Anyone else want to make comments or anything else? Doesn't have to be in response to Josephine's beautiful question to everyone, but if there's anyone else who wants to share anything else, any other views?
Come in? It's Pamela Taylor here. I'm from KPMG, or all views of my own, and I'm from the UK as well, so that's the context that I'm coming on. So the Charles mentioned the Bryden review, and I think that's a really, really good point, and it links in with audit committees publishing their audit and assurance plans, and getting shareholder input through that into risks for the company and the audit as well. I think the other point that I think is worth raising in that context, as we're talking about going concern, is some recommendations in Bryden about resilience statements by companies, covering longer term than the going concern statement, medium term, long term risks, scenarios, etc., that would be outside of the audit, but there may be some assurance on that. And I think that's very interesting, and I think it also might help to identify what is within the audit and what out of the audit, if you've got different forms of assurance happening there.
Thanks, Pamela. Anyone else? Jim's holding up his finger. That means he doesn't have a blue button to push, but he's waving it, so I know that means he wants to talk. So Jim, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to build on what Pamela said. And responding to question 5 in the list of questions, I think everybody on this call probably knows what is the going concern period we're talking about. But I think that if we look at it internationally, it's not the same, Is it 12 months from the balance sheet date? Is it 18 months from the balance sheet date? Is it 12 months from the director's report date? A very simple fix would be to require accounting standard setters to mandate disclosure of the going concern period that management is considering in the notes to the financial statements, whether it's note 1 or wherever you want to put it. Because I think it then will set a tone for readers and users to understand what's the period that is being looked at. And it will help them understand if they don't like it publicly, when they find out what that period is, they will maybe build on the Bryden report and say, we want more information about longer periods. But right now, that's a secret code, this period of going concern, that's known to the profession, and it's not generally known to the public.
Thanks, Jim. And that's a good point about connecting in with other stakeholders, and the International Accounting Standards Board, for example, is a perfect stakeholder that does have a fairly strong influence on what goes into financial reports, and could easily be influencing other things that go in there. And a simple one could be the going concern period, for example. Any other comments? I'll just scroll down my screen because I can only see about 20 people at a time. So just in case there's someone else trying to get my attention by waving at me rather than raising their hand. Anne Molyneux. Good evening, Anne. Lovely to see you. Your blue hand has gone up. Over to you.
Good evening. Yes, indeed. Thank you for that. I just have a question rather than, it's raising in my mind the issue of the auditor and how the auditor views the environment in which these financial statements have been developed. To what extent do auditors, and how do they go about it, assess the governance and the situation the company finds itself in, even before they start applying auditing standards or auditing methodology? Because from my perspective, there is so much pressure. If things are not going well in a firm, not an audit firm, but rather a company, there is so much pressure to really look at the financial statements to see how it can be, not necessarily changed or amended, but what's the impact going to be, and and who's putting pressure on? Is it the CEO? Is it the chairman? Where does the audit committee sit in all of that? What kind of work informs the mind of the auditor as they go into that environment? I think more in that area, by people who are observant, can understand behaviours, might raise more questions in the course of the audit.
Thanks, Anne. And that wasn't a plant question either, but I'd like to have a go at answering it, because there's a new auditing standard called ISA 315 that I chaired the task force for, which covers off exactly some of those topics in getting your understanding of the entity, the control environment, there's a number of components of that control environment, and it does contemplate things like, appropriate skills of the resources at the company, but it also contemplates the governance and the environment, the political environment, the economic environment, a whole range of things that are included in there for auditors to think about. Now, that's all with the mindset of where could there be risks of material misstatement, for example, but that standard is not far off its implementation date. So I'm hopeful that the revised standard will hopefully help drive some of those thinking to be a little more robust in those areas around and really getting a good understanding of the entity and the environment that it operates within, because that does, to your point, Anne, it very much drives some of the risks of where things could be not necessarily manipulated, but if there was going to be fraud or some adjustments made, that it's really important to understand that when you're, even before you start the audit in that planning phase.
I think it sets, I'm sorry, okay. I think it sets the tone for the audit and raises the level of skepticism if you see powerful people in the company, in the organisation, in a pressured state. And you can read this from body behaviour. You can read it from the way in which they walk around the office. Did walk around the office. But I think some of those things are absolutely critical to the mindset of the auditor.
Yep, absolutely. And there is a requirement also in that new standard to think about not just things that confirm what you expect to be in place, but also contradictory evidence as well. So it's to try and enhance and elevate that professional skepticism piece as well. And there's some documentation that goes with it, which I'm sure every auditor is going to hate having to document more on their files, but it is really important. So thank you for that question, Anne. That is perfect timing for us, I think, based on my timetable, to wrap up that conversation. I think we've had a really, really helpful discussion on fraud and going concern. We're going to switch track slightly now. We are going to be talking about auditor reporting, but you'll see going concern also gets a healthy look in there as well. So we're going to go back into breakout rooms. This time a slightly shorter time period. We have 35 minutes in the breakout rooms. They won't be live streamed, those breakout rooms. We are recording them, and obviously we have some helpers who are frantically taking notes as well, but they will be available later. So the streaming on YouTube is going to go on hold. For those of you who are on YouTube and are desperate to see when we'll come back, there should be a counter which is counting down to when we return. For those of you going into the breakout group, same rules apply. You need to do nothing. The magic just happens and you will mysteriously turn up in your hopefully the right breakout group again. And then we will come back again for another brief break before we do a debrief again. So similar process to what we've been through. And I'll stop talking now and hopefully the magic will happen. We'll see you all again soon.
Karen, can you put Seitan in room A?
Okay. Is she gone? There she goes.
Great. Thank you.
Wonder why she didn't go. Did she?
It looked like maybe she had called back in from her phone or something. So maybe something happened with that. Hi, Susan. We are just in breakout rooms right now.
That's all right. I was on a work KPMG meeting.
Oh, okay, no problem. We can put you into your room now, which is room B.
I'm like I thought I was just an external observer.
Oh yeah, you can still just observe, but because of like you're with sort of the IAASB, we thought it would be helpful if some of the observers were actually able to see some of the breakout room discussions.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can send you to one just so you can watch the conversation. But yeah. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Hopefully everybody is slowly joining us back to the large group. Just give the other breakout groups. I think everyone. Okay, so thank you everyone. I think we've all joined back from the various breakout groups. I think there's still a few joining back in, but we should all be back in the room now. So welcome back. We are going to have a 10-minute break. So when your clock, whichever part of the world you're in, says 30 minutes past the hour, so it'll be 11:30 at night for me. I think that makes it 9:30 in the morning for the US. We will be joining back. So enjoy the, unfortunately, 7 minutes that I've given you for your 10-minute break. We will see you all again shortly.
hopefully people are starting to join in again. Just give everyone another 20 seconds to join in. Okay, by my screen, it looks like most people are back. We haven't lost too many people during the break, which is good. So welcome back to everybody, and welcome back to those who are following us live on our YouTube streaming that we have going. We are going to kick off with a quick polling question now. So hopefully Armand or Karen can put up the polling question. And the polling question is, from all of the changes in the new and revised auditor reporting standards that have been effective since calendar 2016, obviously not in all jurisdictions, I think the following has been most effective. So CAMS, they're providing more transparency into the audit as intended. Reordering the auditor's report by putting the opinion first has helped. The separate section detailing material uncertainty related to going concern, or none of the above, it still doesn't meet my expectations. So I'll just give you all 15 to 20 seconds to answer the polling question, and then we will share the results. Look at that. CAMS, clear winner, 84%, providing the transparency, followed by 10% of reordering the auditor's report, and then 3% for the other two, which is probably just one or two people's responses to that section, but certainly a very strong response. Key audit matters has been the most effective in the new auditor's report, so that's fabulous to see. So well done, IAASB. And Dan, I think you chaired that task force, so well done as well on that brilliant idea, which obviously has been very well received. We are going to go through a brief feedback session now with each of the moderators from A, B, C, D, and E, and I will stick to my new alphabet in order this time, just to briefly discuss the top 3 or 4 things that were discussed in your breakout group. So I will kick off first, and we got through all of the questions, which was good. There was very clear support, very similar to that polling question, that CAM reporting has been helpful and is a positive development, particularly in areas of judgment and estimation. And it's enhanced audit quality, but has also enhanced the quality of the discussions and communications with the audit committees and with the board. And that clear evidence is also supported in academic research. And one of the interesting observations was in that research that the more critical the language is used, the higher the value perceived, as opposed to more confirmatory language that the auditor might use in their report. We also talked about the use of findings, which we've seen in one firm in particular globally uses that in their audit reports. And while that can create the risk of piecemeal opinions, it was also felt that some kind of observations can be helpful. And I know certainly was raised in our group as well that the Bryden report also supported that that approach of gradated findings. We also covered off, the challenges around going concern, and we also reflected on, Jim, your suggestion as well. And there was a suggestion that, some of the challenge could be solved by local or international accounting standard setters, particularly to cover off either going concern periods, but also explaining risks better. Then obviously the auditor would be required to audit those disclosures if it was part of the financial statements. Also to include more from the management side. So for example, sensitivity analysis or, risks to the business. But overall as well, the comment was that everyone has a role to play in this space, not just us as the International Auditing Standards Board. And then the final comment I will draw out, because I'm sure there's going to be comments we also discussed that will be raised by other groups as well. But when we talked about what else could be added to the audit report, certainly there was the comment around guarding against just continually adding to the audit report. It was more about how to make the content as engaging as possible for the users and as accessible as possible for the users, and much less about just adding more and more to the audit report. So on that note, I will go to the second letter of the alphabet, which, unless you've gone and swapped behind my back again as a bit of a gag joke, it should be Dan as Group B.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. And I think much the same discussion in Group B, an overall feeling that certainly the auditor's report now is better. It presents a broader view of the relevant matters for the audit, what an audit is, what an auditor does, and in general terms provides enhanced information to users. Perhaps a mixed views in terms of increased confidence in the quality of the audit, but I think as we'll see, there certainly is some support for that. I mean, overall, CAMS, I think got very good reviews, which is, it's good to know that perhaps the objectives that the IAASB set out are in fact being met. But it depends a little bit on the stakeholders, that management and those charged with governance have an interest in CAMS and the discussions. Some users are focusing more on the opinion, and that they perhaps more interest in other types of information like management commentary, KPIs, sustainability reporting. On the positive side, though, there are many positives that were noted, that users are paying more attention to those areas of the financial statements that are covered by CAMS. And there's some academic research that indicates, from a standpoint of auditor liability exposure, that if anything, perhaps the communication of CAMS is providing some degree of protection in that regard. But on the negative side, the group talked about the boilerplate nature of CAMS and the need to continue to evolve those communications. With respect to transparency on going concern, I think similar to what Fiona said, a lot goes back to the financial reporting ecosystem, that there's more accountability perhaps needed from management and those charged with governance to make sure that the risks and disclosures are being disclosed properly. And that perhaps even in the 2020 reporting season, there may be some movement in that regard. In terms of other information, very similar. There was some just talk about materiality. That's a difficult concept, needs further discussion, but just in general on balance, to make sure that useful information is provided, but not so much that it makes the report more difficult to read or understand.
Thanks, Dan. That sounds quite consistent with some of the conversations in our group. The next letter of the alphabet is C, which is Josephine.
And I'm still C. I've not played a trick, so I'll kick off. Again, similar comments. I'll try not to repeat everything said before, but similarly, participants notice that CAMS are welcome inclusion, but what makes them helpful is when they are very specific to the entity, which is similar to Dan's point about some being somewhat boilerplate in their disclosure. We understand they've given better insight into the financial statements, but what has been interesting is where management's focus on certain disclosures is not always aligned with the auditor's focus on those disclosures. So what might be a CAM might be somewhat nestled also in the financial statements than one would expect. So that was an interesting observation. The participants agreed that they have actually helped to sharpen management's attention, and there has been improved focus by auditors as well. Investors, similar to Dan's comments, would support more information on fraud and are also asking for more disclosures in climate risk and ECGs. But we talked about the financial ecosystem and particularly around the challenges around going concern and the need for better management disclosure And then we can make a step as to whether there could be enhancements to the auditor's report, which would follow, obviously, greater disclosure by management. There was general caution again that developing auditor responsibilities and management responsibilities is not actually helpful, and it boils down to boilerplate and may in fact obscure important points. It's very much back to that point about really making them as entity specific as you can. We did have a brief conversation on the inconsistency potentially in the number of CAMs across jurisdictions. And whilst CAMs are obviously entity specific, and so we could never say that there is a certain number that should always be disclosed, this might be something worth looking into. And perhaps there is a need to better explain how the scope of the audit and the identification of risks fits in with the journey to the auditor's decision as to what are the CAMs that are eventually reported in the auditor's report. And I believe, well, I mean, obviously we talked about a lot of other things, but that was probably the key points. Thank you.
Thanks, Josephine. Julie, you should be next.
Yes, some of the highlights, and Fiona, similar comments to what others have made. We started into question 1 and we quickly jumped to CAM, but just on question 1, we talked about liking the opinion first. Keeping in mind that some of the other content can be a bit boilerplate, so definitely the opinion first helped. And there was a question in our group, which was a good question about who's the reader of these reports? Do they really understand what everything in the report is saying? And we're probably gearing the report more at this point to an informed or educated reader as opposed to the general public. So maybe from a general public perspective, I don't know if we've moved the bar, but from an educated reader, they would understand the reorganization and what took place. CAMs, similar to what Josephine just described, they can be boilerplate, so definitely useful, and they probably encouraged a lot more conversation with management and those charged with governance to really get a view as to what the auditor thinks is most significant to the audit. But the focus really to make them useful should be on the reason as to why it was a key audit matter, what actually occurred to make that key audit matter happen, how did we deal with it, were there any disagreements in dealing with it, and how did the conclusion come to be. Enhancements to the auditor's report on going concern, an interesting conversation we had, which was are users really seeing this as a change, because we previously had an emphasis of matter paragraph required from a going concern perspective. So some questions about why is it in a separate section? Why can't it just be part of CAM? And is the wording that we have in the separate section really telling the story, or could it be better told in a CAM-like scenario? So I thought that was an interesting observation, and it's definitely coming up more and more now with the current environment and the discussion that a lot of auditors are having with their clients with respect to going concern. So maybe some questions to probe there. And then on things to include, probably not surprising to all of you, but things around summary of the main audit approach. Like, what kind of audit approach did the auditor take to the audit? Was it controls focused or more substantive focused? Audit materiality came up, red flags or signals in the audit and how the auditor dealt with them, any engagement the auditor did with stakeholders, and then a comment around the audit fee. Now, I will just say, I think collectively as a group, our group felt that the standards were good. There wasn't really a need to make changes to them. We probably need some more time for things to settle in and get some more experience with them. But overall, those were some of the discussion points we had in the group, Fiona.
Great, thanks, Julie. That's helpful. And Group E, which is Billy.
Thank you, Fiona. I mean, after everything that has been said already, I think I'm just going to touch on 2 points that came out of our group quite strongly. The one was very interesting. Obviously, a lot of support for CAM. But what was interesting is that it seems as if investors also get a lot of value out of CAM for collateral benefits that CAM bring. In terms of, at least when you see a key audit matter, it communicates a message that this is something that has been discussed with the audit committee and those charged with governance. So if there's a key audit matter around climate-related risk, the investor at least know this was raised with the audit committee and was discussed with them. And then obviously the very real benefit of giving the key points that the investors can then engage on with those charge of governance and get that accountability bedded down quite strongly. And then the other point that came out is also around the information needs outside of the financial statements. A lot of focus on sustainability, ESG reporting. There was a strong feeling in our group that companies' risk reporting needs to improve in terms of understanding management and those charge of governance insight into risk, but also admitting that that's not something that can really be addressed in the auditor's report on the financial statements, but more that sense that you've got the core, which is the audit of the financial statements, but we're going to see that there's a need for things around the score that needs to be developed, both from a reporting point of view and then from an assurance point of view. Thank you, Fiona.
Thanks, Philly. That's helpful. And I know you would have covered off a lot of what the other groups covered off as well. So thank you for focusing on the couple of differences. So I'm just looking at the clock. We have, excuse me, we have 10 minutes left for an open discussion now on this part, unless you suddenly thought of something on the first part around expectation gap you wanted to raise. But it's an opportunity for anyone to raise anything else they wanted to discuss around the auditor reporting standard and going concern in particular. I will open it up for any comments, and they can be controversial if you would like. Nobody wants to hear me sing. That I'm pretty confident of. So I'll give you another couple of seconds. Otherwise, I'm going to make up a question. Suresh, thank you so much. In the breakout group, he was keen to put his hand up first as well. So thank you very much. And I didn't tell you, so you weren't voluntold. So thank you for volunteering in the true sense, Suresh. I think you're on mute still. I can see your lips moving, but I can't hear anything.
Sorry about that. Yeah, you know, some time ago at the IAASB, we discussed the concept of a forensic phase in the audit. Is that no longer, and I know the consequence, what we dealt with, and Jim was around at the time, so maybe he can add, we included some of those procedures into the standard, but the concept of a forensic phase of the audit, is that something that's just not viable?
Would you maybe give me a little more clarity as to what you mean by the forensic phase? I've only been involved for about 5 years, so I don't have any of the history that many of you here have, because you've been around the table for a lot longer or involved for a lot longer, but I'm just curious what you mean by forensic phase of the audit.
There was, I think it was in the US, there was a study done on audit failures and scandals, and there were certain lessons that came out of that exercise. It was, I think, the scandals over 50 years or something, and the learnings out of it. And there was a thought that, you know, taking all those learnings into account, there should be certain audit procedures that should be mandatory on every audit. And that was kind of termed as the forensic phase of the audit. But then we kind of moved away from that because we thought it was giving kind of the expectation maybe just too high in terms of what we say in that regard, that we've done a forensic kind of audit. So I think we stayed away from that. But having said that, we included some of those audit procedures within the current standards. So it just, is that a dead thought?
It's not one that I've come across, and Villy's been at the table less than I have at the international standard setting level, but I'm just having a look. We've got Dan, we've got Villy, and Jim's signalling to me. I think that's a secret signal. That wasn't really a wave, it was a half-hearted, do I really want to get involved in this? But I'm going to throw to you, Jim.
When I find my blue hand, I'll be better off. But I think Suresh's point was, in fact, at the time, we talked about the importance of looking at journal entries. And I think that was sort of the example that was built into the standard rather than mandating specific procedures. We've already had a discussion earlier today that maybe that's no longer the right thing to be looking at. But it may be that the idea of focusing on the procedures that historically might have found frauds that have taken place and making them examples somewhere in the standard could be useful. And I think there already has been a discussion about the need to perhaps update that example, because looking at journal entries no longer necessarily is the right solution, but 100% testing of big data might be the right sort of model to put in. I don't think we need to developing a new ISA on the forensics procedures to be carried out in every audit. That might be going a bit too far.
Thank you. Well, I know one of the things that we've been looking at is has been quite a bit of work done by Angela and Bev and a number of others at the board level in terms of the staff around looking at all of the academic research that's been done, particularly more recently rather than maybe, I'm not sure when the forensic phase was debated, but looking at that as one of the inputs into you know, what might be driving fraud. We had our first roundtable, which was focused on the use of technology in fraud, not just around how auditors use technology, for example, so data analytics or automated tools and techniques, as we call them, but also how technology may be used to perpetrate fraud as well, because that then means you have to audit very differently in that situation as well. So that's another input into, you know, are there things that we should be doing differently? To your point, Jim and Suresh, you know, the world has moved a little. Is auditing journal entries still the right way to do? I'd have to say all the frauds I've seen, including one last year, it was journal entries that they used to do it. So I'm not sure that I would be a fan of moving away from journal entries, but I do think it is an important phase of this particular project. Nothing's off the table. So if there's been other thinking that's been done earlier around these sorts of things, and maybe it's time to reflect on some of that as well, as to, you know, were there other things considered when you talked about the forensic phase of the audit that maybe were discounted because they weren't really, you know, far enough evolved. You might have probably talked about technology back then and audit techniques. They're now part of what we do every day. So maybe we should be enhancing it. Nothing's off the table. We're trying to get as much input as possible. So certainly I've written down that just to do a bit more reflection, a bit more digging on, as well as good input into, you know, our conversation around fraud in particular. I can see Douglas has his hand up as well. Douglas.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. You know, one thing that I've observed over the years is that oftentimes planning analytics tend to be done in a perfunctory manner. And a companion observation, we've seen several of the major frauds that have been discovered by people completely on the outside, short sellers, for example, that are looking at big trends in the data and relationships in the data, and actually discovering some of the bigger frauds. If you put those two things together, I wonder if there isn't some opportunity for us to do a better job in planning analytics. And this is not a new topic, but it seems like it's still kind of perfunctory. And sometimes we have the intern or the, you know, a light senior or staff doing the planning analytics and looking at relationships in the financial statements. Sometimes it's a simple this year, last year, and what's the percentage change, instead of saying, are there relationships among financial statement elements that don't make sense, that we could dig in further? When there's massive fraud going on, there are going to be some things in those relationships that are going to stand out. And that's why sometimes short sellers detect frauds and the auditors don't. So I really think maybe a refocus at that high level early in the planning stages and looking at those financial statement relationships could be a fruitful area for auditors in the area of fraud.
Thank you. That's a good suggestion. Anything else people wanted to raise? Charles.
I just want to add that without really knowing what happened in Wirecard, but just from that perspective, I think from a user investor point of view, and to Douglas's point, I think cash is king, and it strikes me just from my experience over the last 4 years as being a member of the Audit Quality Review Committee in the UK that it's astonishing where some audits take it for granted that you don't really need to do much around cash or cash at bank, and it would appear in Wirecard's case that sort of almost taking it for granted that not enough was done around verifying cash at bank. But that the organisation was able to create this big black hole in the organisation. So I think not taking things for granted and making sure that cash is audited properly, I think are probably other areas that need to be considered.
Thanks, Charles. Any other comments people wanted to raise? No, that's probably perfect timing then, according to my instructions of when I'm supposed to move on or hand to the next person. It is exactly now at 11:55 my time, or 9:55 US time. So I will close the discussion that we've just had on that topic, and thank you very much for everyone's willingness to participate. I know that I can confidently say that the conversations we had in our breakout group, I'm sure, were equally as passionate and robust in all the other breakout groups, and we really do appreciate everyone's feedback and input. Certainly appreciate everyone as well for watching us on YouTube. Not sure if I would be doing it at the time of night it is for me, but certainly it's a very interesting topic that we've been talking about tonight. So with that, I will close my role of moderating the session, and I will pass to Tom, who will do the formal close of the session. So over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you particularly to Fiona and Josephine for sort of shepherding us through today's program. Also, thank you to the moderators. But most of all, thank you to the participants in this roundtable. We certainly love to get your feedback on how you thought it went. We're obviously experimenting with new formats in this COVID world, but to me, I learned a huge amount just by listening. I observed and just was trying to take in what everyone was saying. So thank you. These topics are high priority on our work plan right now, and they're key to our strategy about enhancing confidence in the role of the profession and insurance. So thank you for all your thoughtful comments today. Also, thank you to those who are following us by YouTube, because you're keeping us honest, keeping us accountable. So thank you for doing that. I certainly encourage everyone to continue to follow the IAASB's works on LinkedIn and Twitter, where we put up a lot of updates and interesting information about our work as well. So with that, I close the session. We have a lot more work to continue to do on fraud and going concern. Our next stop really is our roundtable focused on LCEs on October 7th. And I encourage everyone to participate in a comment process as related to the discussion paper that was published. So thank you. I'll speak to you shortly, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.